Good morning, everyone. Before I ask our witness to be brought in, can I just say something about the way, well, I say we dealt with, responsibility is entirely mine. We dealt with Mr. Ellis's request to ask questions on Monday. Reflecting on what I did, I think perhaps I should just clarify what I would expect to happen in future. On Monday, Mr. Ellis wanted to ask some questions of Mr. Baxter. He had a discussion at the desk with Mr. McClelland. Mr. McClelland indicated that he was not inclined to ask the questions. And what then happened was that I simply invited Mr. Ellis to ask his questions. Now, no criticism of Mr. Ellis, no criticism of Mr. McClelland, all the criticism points in my direction. Because when one looks at Rule 9, what I should have done at that stage is to invite Mr. Ellis to have made an oral application in terms of Rule 9. So, departure from a procedure which should have been followed, responsibility for that departure mine, and just to clarify that when these circumstances arise in future, it's not that I'm in any way innovating on what's been previously said, but if such a situation, or when such a situation arises in future, we'll ask the witness to leave the inquiry or the hearing room for the moment, and I will hear a formal application, which I'll then consider, and depending on the way that that's decided, then the legal representative may be able to ask questions. So my apologies, and we'll try and keep to the procedure in future. So with that, Mr. McGregor, we're in a position to lead Mr. Currie. Right. Good morning, Mr. Currie. Now, as you appreciate, you're about to be asked some questions by Mr. McGregor, QC, who's sitting on my right. But before then, can I ask you to make an affirmation? Just sitting where you are, would you repeat these words after me? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
Solemnly, sincerely, and
declare and affirm
declare and confirm
that I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but
Thank you very much, Mr. Currie. Now, the plan this morning will be to sit until 1 o'clock, when we'll take a break for lunch. But should you wish to take a break for any reason whatsoever, before then, just give an indication to me, and we'll take a break. The other thing is, the microphone should help you. I think one probably has to direct speech at the microphone, but maybe just keep your voice up a little beyond what you would normally use in conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Lord. Mr. Currie, could you tell the inquiry your full name, please?
Brian James Currie.
And are you employed as a Senior Programme Director with NHS Lothian?
I am, yes.
Now, you've provided a witness statement to the inquiry which is found at pages 201 to 223 of the bundle, and an appendix at pages 223 to 231. Could I ask you to have your statement in front of you, please?
I have it here, thanks. Yeah.
And if we could look to paragraph 2 of your statement.
Yes,
Approximately 4 lines down, you'll see a sentence beginning, "I've been asked to provide." Do you see that?
I do, yeah.
And it says, "I've been asked to provide a written statement to the Scottish Hospitals Inquiry in relation to my involvement in the project from the commencement up to the start of the procurement exercise." You see that?
I do.
So, just to be clear, Mr. Currie, I'm going to ask you questions about that part of the project in terms of the chronology. You've helpfully provided the inquiry with clarification in terms of your views on certain other issues within your statement, the procurement exercise, the contract. I'm not making any criticism. It's just simply to let you know that those issues will be explored at later stages of the inquiry. So just if we don't cover those today,
Yep.
It's not that we're going to avoid coming back to them, it's just that they're not for today.
Understood, yeah.
Your statement's going to provide part of your evidence to the inquiry, but I'm going to also ask you some questions today. I should say it's not a memory test. You fairly say in your statement that a lot of the underlying events took place a significant time ago. If you want to look back to your statement at any point, please do just let me know.
Thank you.
If I could begin with your background and experience, you tell us at paragraph 3 of your statement that you qualified as an architect. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So in the 1980s, you worked as an architect in private practice, and then thereafter moved into working on construction projects.
That's correct.
Can you just explain to the inquiry, when you moved away from working solely as an architect into construction projects, what type of work were you undertaking at that stage in your career?
I joined a national retail bank as an architect, actually. That was the label, and it quickly changed to a project manager, as was the trend at that time. In the latter days in private practice, it was a management role anyway, more than anything. So I moved into general project management at that time of a corporate company's estate.
And in terms of project management, on a day-to-day basis, what would you be doing?
It's principally about managing people and about managing processes. So it's about managing a team, building a team, leading a team or teams, depending on the size of the programme or projects, organising stakeholders, making sure that they are part of the project. So it's about people and about processes. So the end user input to the project, value management, change management, risk management, communicating, reporting, basically keeping the wheels moving of any project or series of projects within a programme.
And you then tell us that prior to joining the NHS, you worked for Lend-Lease projects, is that correct?
Prior to joining NHS, yes.
And can you just explain to the inquiry, when you were working for Lend-Lease projects, what was your role and what were you doing?
The role was really running the Scottish side and the Newcastle area, northeast of England, offices. There was 3 project offices made up of project managers, and I was the person running as regional director those 3 offices and the staff. So it was chasing work, chasing invoices, that sort of thing. So it was very much the business management end of it.
And you tell us within your statement that at that point in your career you were involved in a number of complex construction projects, including, for example, the Royal Bank of Scotland's Gogarburn campus.
Yep.
And you state at paragraph 3 of your statement that you've got significant experience in delivering high value and complex construction projects.
Yeah, I've had a very varied background in terms of sectors that I've worked in, from commercial retail banking through leisure hospitality, healthcare, residential, rail infrastructure, and also working on the client side, consultant side, and the contractor side.
And you tell us within your statement, particularly at paragraph 54, that in August 2009 you joined NHS Lothian. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Now, we'll come on to deal with the work that you did in 2009 whenever you joined NHS Lothian. But in terms of your current role, are you still with NHS Lothian?
I am, yes.
And what does your current work for NHS Lothian involve?
NHS Lothian have just embarked on titled a Major Projects Programme, where there are 3 large projects at different stages, which I am leading as Senior Programme Director. So they are the Edinburgh Cancer Centre, the Edinburgh Eye Pavilion or Eye Hospital, and a new National Treatment Centre at Livingston.
So 3 healthcare projects that you're working on at the minute, and I'm sorry, I didn't pick it. Was it a project management role that you said you're doing in those roles?
Yes, my title is Senior Programme Director. We have just recruited teams, project management teams, into the service for each of those projects.
And who within NHS Lothian would have appointed you to those projects?
The current executive. So my main reporting line is through the Director of Finance and through the SRO, Senior Responsible Officer, for those projects.
Thank you. Now, if I could just ask you some questions about when you joined NHS Lothian in 2009, what was your title and role at that point?
My role was as Project Director for the then Sick Kids Hospital project, which was a capital funded project. It had received an OBC, I think, in 2008. A framework contractor had been appointed early 2009, and the health board were needing to bring in more resource into that project.
Okay. So you join NHS Lothian and you're working on the re-provision of the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department of Clinical Neurosciences, is that right?
That's correct,
okay.
Yeah.
No, I'll just refer to that as the project. So if I'm referring to the project, that's what I'm referring to, sure. Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department of Clinical Neuroscience. And in terms of the chronology, if you're joining in 2009, the inquiries heard evidence that the initial agreement was 2006, with the outline business case being produced in 2008, and you're then joining in 2009 after the approval of the outline business case, when it's a capital project at that point.
Correct, yeah.
Do you recall, who did you replace as project director?
Wasn't so much replace, I seem to recall. There was a project director in that role. The lady in question was very much of a clinical background. When I came in, not from a strictly clinical background, obviously, I took on the role of project director, and I think we titled her role something like clinical project director. So it was very much a complementary skills, as most projects are within the team. So I was heavily involved in the direction of the project in terms of construction and delivery and procurement. And Isabel McCallum was the lady in question. She was the main interface with the clinical teams in the service.
So just so I can understand it, in the period up until 2009, there's effectively been a clinical lead as project director.
Yes, that's my understanding.
And then from 2009 onwards, after there's been approval of the outlined business case, you're coming in as someone who's got more of a construction background. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Can you just explain to the inquiry, in your role as project director, what are you doing on a day-to-day basis? What does that role involve?
I think I mentioned it earlier when you asked what I was doing prior to NHS Lothian. It's very similar. It's project management is about people and processes. So at the risk of repeating what I said earlier, it's about initially building a team, strengthening that team, leading and managing the team of complementary skilled professionals coming from quite a varied background, a huge range and variety of stakeholders on the kids project. It's an Edinburgh project. It has regional and certainly national implications. And then the processes. Project management is about managing processes, and I listed them earlier. From risk to risk management. Can't remember what I said now, but there's a whole list of processes in there.
And who are you reporting into?
I report to the Director of Finance as my line management.
If I could ask you to have in front of you, please, within the initial agreement, now the initial agreement starts in Bundle 3, Volume 1 at page 95, but it's just an organogram that I'd like to take you to. So it's Bundle 3, Volume 1 at page 109. So you should see in the top left-hand corner, it will say Appendix 3, but there should really be a whole series of boxes starting with NHS Lothian Board.
I have it here.
Do you see that?
Yeah.
So if you just assist the inquiry, at the very top of the organisation chart, we've got the NHS Lothian Board. Below that, we've got the Executive Management Team. Below that, a Strategic Change Programme Board. And then leading down towards a Project Board and a Core Project Team. Were you involved in the Core Project Team?
Yeah, I think that would be the project team, as I would see it. Yeah. I've not seen it referred to core project team for many years, but it's the project team, yes.
And above that, you'll see that there's the project board. Were you involved with the project board?
I was, yes.
So again, just so I can understand where the project director would sit, you're involved with the core project team. Is that effectively doing the day-to-day of the project?
Yes, I'm leading that project team and all the various activities, duties that they have, yeah.
Okay, and then you're also sitting on the project board. What's the project board doing?
Project board is there as a governance and assurance mechanism where issues that need to be escalated and discussed at a higher level are brought forward to that project board. It's constituted with a whole variety of, again, stakeholders within the board and outside the board in this case. It was a progress monitoring vehicle as well, in the sense of brought various reports from the various work streams as an update. And again, if there was anything of significance and interest, that would be escalated further to things like the F&R committee and eventually the main board when it came to very, very strategic things such as appointment of, in this case, I presume a PSCP prior to my involvement, but certainly the special purpose vehicle that we eventually selected.
So we'll come on to that. So we've got the core project team doing the day-to-day work. They would then report into the project board. You said that there were people internal to NHS Lothian and then also people external to NHS Lothian. So what individuals or organisations external to NHS Lothian would be involved in the project board?
We had representatives from the immediate health boards, so Fife, Jason Galloway. We also had people from the University of Edinburgh because there was a university component in the projects. We had people from Scottish Government, Health Directorate, SFT were part of the board. And then the rest, I think, were generally internal to Lothian.
You mentioned SFT, is that Scottish Futures Trust?
Correct. Yeah.
And in terms of Scottish Futures Trust being involved with the project board, is an individual from Scottish Futures Trust sitting on the board in a decision-making capacity, or are they there in an advisory capacity?
I always saw them as an advisor. I think they used the phrase, "we're here as your critical friend," seemed to be used a lot. So they presumably made decisions in their own right in terms of their programme of works, but I don't think they were a decision maker as such on the board.
But when there's a meeting of the project board, there's an individual from Scottish Futures Trust who attends those board meetings. Again, just thinking of how things might be escalated if the project board wants to escalate it. You mentioned a committee that you referred to as the FFR.
F&R.
What's the F and R?
They're principally there to keep the finger on the pulse with the financial arrangements and the costs of projects, the expenditure that the board has in terms of revenue, capital funded projects.
So you used an acronym. What does the acronym stand for?
Finance and Resources Committee.
Finances and Resources Committee. So matters presumably of a financial nature are escalated from project board to that committee.
Yes.
And you mentioned then NHS Lothian board itself. I think you used the term that it would be strategic decisions that they would be making in the project. Yes,
I seem to recall attending quite a few main board meetings where things were at a sufficient pitch, if you like, in terms of importance. So the appointment of the preferred bidder, when we were contemplating litigation at a future date. So some very serious and significant issues would be escalated to the main board or the F&R committee, and an extraordinary F&R committee would be set up.
Thank you. Now, in terms of the project team and what we'll see below that, you mentioned within your statement that you led the NHS Lothian project team of 12 managers. Again, just at a very high level of generality, what types of individuals are then feeding in terms of these 12 managers to you and your role as project director?
Sure, it varied. 12 is probably an average. I mean, sometimes we had about 16 or more. So they came from a variety of parts of the health service. There were generally what's called placements into the project. So capital planning would supply project managers who were a technical nature. We had people from a clinical nursing background. So it was a very good variety of people. We had people from estates and facilities who, again, are a technical background. And other people that came through the service in terms of operational management, strategic planning, as we call it, background. So it was a very good mix of, as I said before, complementary skills.
So you mentioned capital planning as one example. What would the capital planning team be doing on the project?
They were principally involved in interpreting the clinical requirements and translating that into schedules of accommodation and into a technical form. That was really their big input. Also, linked to that, equipment scheduling as well, which is, as you can imagine, a huge component in a healthcare facility.
Now, we'll come on to talk about external advisors in a moment, but the inquiry's heard evidence that NHS Lothian had appointed external advisors both when the project's capital funded and when it's revenue funded. In terms of those external advisors, how would they link in either the core project team or to the project board? How did those linkages take place?
It's slightly different in both. The project sits in two phases, as you're well aware. So that the capital funded project, there were professional services contracts with a company that supplied cost consultancy, project management service, and planning supervisor, it was called, in an NEC 3 contract. They also would, not particularly on this project, but they can in other projects, the ones I'm doing at the moment, for example, they have the ability to subcontract to technical people like architects, engineers, etc. Of course, that didn't apply on this project when it was capital funded because we had a principal supply chain partner on board and they had their own supply chain of designers. When it became MPD, similarly, we had to expand that advisory base, if you like, not be far beyond technical, which we certainly needed to have, but we had to employ a legal advice and finance advice on an MPD.
Now, we'll come on to explore the term I'm going to use in a moment in greater detail, but one of the terms that the inquiry has heard so far from other witnesses is the reference design team at a certain point.
Yeah.
In terms of the structure that we're looking at, how would that reference design team link into the core project team and or the project board?
Yeah, that was a unique vehicle again because of the nature of NPD and the challenges that we were facing at the time to communicate to bidders what we had as mandatory requirements, principally operational functionality. To do that with also the whole premise of MPD is to transfer sufficient risk to the private sector, then satisfy European accounting rules, and the Scottish Government can then cope with the project or log the project off balance sheet. So it's all about transfer of risk. So we were trying to devise a vehicle that enables us to communicate in an illustrative way operational requirements, which are about adjacencies of rooms to rooms within departments, departments to departments within a building. And also on the basis of, I think you've heard from other witnesses, 2 supplemental agreements that we had to agree with Consort Healthcare to, first of all, release the land and also get rights of access and oversale rights for cranes and all sorts of things and services. In doing that, we were obliged to adhere to very, very specific requirements. For instance, the public utilities coming into the site was down through a very specific corridor, which we had no latitude on. So that became a compulsory requirement for bidders, because we had...
We'll come on to all of that, but just if we stand back from the detail, just at a level of generality, there's this body called the Reference Design Team.
Yep.
They want to have input to NHS Lothian. What's the linkage between Reference Design Team and the organogram that we're looking at? So
the Reference Design Team were ring-fenced. Sorry, I need to explain this, I think, because it is important. They were ring-fenced from the other work streams developing what became the invitation to participate in dialogue information. So board's construction requirements being a principal part of it. And they were ring-fenced because we were keen that the designers that were employed through our project managers to do the reference design were not precluded from bidding at a future date. Scottish Futures Trust were not initially too keen on that. They thought they should be not allowed to bid. There's a very limited pool of these people, and we felt it'd be restrictive. So, taking legal advice and contracts advice, what we did was we ring-fenced that reference design team in the sense that there were people from the project team, so the clinical director at the time and a couple of project managers, along with the project managers externally, managed that reference design team. And I think to answer your original question, the output from that developing reference design was fed in to the project board through myself and the clinical project director.
And was anyone from capital planning involved in that linkage?
Very much so. One project manager, particularly from memory, was capital planning, and the other was from a clinical nursing background.
Can you remember the names of those individuals?
Neil McLennan and Fiona Halcrow, I think. And certainly Janice McKenzie was the clinical director. Yeah.
Did Mr. Ian Graham have any involvement in that linkage between reference design and NHS Lothian?
Not so much. No, Ian was very busy on other things. Ian's role developed in the project to very much looking at the legal side of it.
No, I think you were telling the inquiry about some of the site constraints that the project had, and again, just so that you're referenced within your statement, I'm really looking at paragraph 6 of your statement onwards. And at that point, you mentioned that there comes a point within the project whereby there's an existing private finance initiative at the site in Little France, and there's then going to be potentially another revenue-funded hospital that's coming onto the same site. And you outlined that you consider that there's quite a lot of challenges associated with that. What were some of the challenges that you faced as project director?
When it became, when the project came to an abrupt halt in the capital funding and it became MPD as it transpired, I think there was 4 kind of areas questions that we asked ourselves really. The first one was, well, what is the scope of the project now? Where was it? When was it expected? And how were we going to get there? So I'll just take the first 3 first because they're quite simple, really. The what was now a combination of the Children's Hospital and the Neurosciences Hospital. So we knew our scope. The where was the Royal Infirmary. Nobody was saying it's the wrong site. It had gone through an options appraisal many years ago. And the when was very clear. It was ASAP. The how bit was the difficult bit and was the challenge all the way through. And how we did it was, just as we're saying here, we had to bring in a commercial organisation that is significantly risk averse, facing another commercial organisation with the same approach. We looked at were there precedents for this in the UK or anywhere actually in the world. I think we found one educational establishment in England somewhere that had a PFI on a PFI. Most of the time, these PFI sites are extended by the original PFI operator. But this was quite a unique occurrence, and we knew that this would be challenging. The challenges were, just as I said, about risk and who took risk for certain things. From a practical point of view, it was the ability that the new hospital was as autonomous as possible, so it stood on its own feet from a services point of view. So one PFI operator was not dependent on another PFI operator and vice versa. So trying to make it as clean as possible, trying to reduce the number of physical connections for obvious reasons as well, and then the operational requirements with two PFI operators adjoining one another in terms of the campus.
Because again, within your statement at paragraph 20, for example, you make the point to say that healthcare projects are always complicated and major high-value projects will always have significant complexities. But in terms of the additional complexities in terms of putting a revenue-funded project within a revenue-funded project, was there any real specifics to that beyond what you've already explained?
I think the biggest difference was the imposition of the finance and legal requirements that MPD brought. I mean, we would always had the technical challenges for sure, but I think it was the additional load, if you like, of the labyrinth of lawyers and financiers that were involved all the way through.
And how time-consuming was all of that for the project team to work through?
It took a lot longer to get to probably where we wanted to be than we would have done. It would always been difficult with the PFI operator get the supplemental agreements that were so essential. But I think it just added complexity and time for sure.
And again, just one of the terms of reference that the inquiry requires to grapple with is whether ultimately the site was appropriate for the hospital. And certainly I had you noted as saying that despite all the difficulties, complexities and challenges that you talked about in your evidence and in your statement, you said that no one thought it was the wrong site.
Absolutely.
So
no,
why do you say that?
Well, the option appraisal had been done before I started with NHS Lothian, but it was very apparent to me, listening to colleagues and looking at the clinical justifications, that bringing paediatric services and neurosciences to our already acute hospital with the benefits of sharing emergency facilities, sharing critical care facilities, etc., and particularly the synergy with neurosciences and the University of Edinburgh, who are on the campus as a teaching hospital, it all made absolute sense to me as a non-clinician, I have to say, but just as a layperson. So I was never other than convinced that it was the right site.
Thank you. Now, within your statement from paragraphs 7 to 15, you addressed two supplemental agreements, Supplemental 6 and Supplemental Agreement 7. Am I right in thinking that Supplemental Agreement 6 was effectively aimed at securing the land that formed Car Park B, where the new hospital was ultimately constructed?
Correct, yeah.
And again, just in your role as project manager, what, if anything, were you doing in relation to Supplemental Agreement 6?
Well, I was part of the team that were negotiating with Concert Healthcare. I was feeding in the practical needs of the project. So in terms of the access to the site, as I mentioned earlier, the services, there was quite a big deal made of oversealing of cranes, etc., and how would they affect the Royal Infirmary. So where there were construction issues and development issues of that nature, I would feed into the legal and finance team.
And then again, you explained that Supplemental Agreement 7 is really aimed at what you describe as various enabling works. Could you just explain, again, for lay individuals, what do you mean by enabling works? Well,
almost any construction site, any development site is not, unless it is deliberately designed that way, is not ready to take a building. It needs enabled. And this was certainly the case here, because Car Park B was a car park and had never been designed as anything else. So There were major utilities running through the site. There was 2 sewers actually. We had to divert one of the sewers, the twin trunk sewer, to the south. We had to reroute Consort's private gas pipe. There was fibre optic cables from the university running everywhere. So there was a lot of services lifting and shifting, as it's called. There was also the need to bring the flood prevention facilities at the campus up to modern standards. Whether it's to do with climate change or not, the world has moved on in the 20, 30 years since it was designed, and there's now a much more onerous flood defence requirement as part of our planning consent. So with flood prevention works, the other major change was the existing bus network serving the Royal Infirmary, the loop road that came in with bus stances. We had to sever that basically to get our physical connection to the Royal Infirmary, which meant rerouting the buses to the east of the hospital, creating a new bus hub to the east. The other thing that was very important was to create, or Consort to create, I should say that Consort initiated and actually delivered all these works for us. The other thing was to create some people refer to it as I think I coined the phrase, a docking station. So rather than the new PFI operator coming in and physically attacking, if you like, the Royal Infirmary, we'd get the Royal Infirmary PFI operator to create a plug-and-play type facility so they could connect with little difficulty into the Royal. So that was work at the emergency department. It meant partial demolitions and the creation of this stub or nib coming out of the Royal.
So again, if we boil down Settlement Agreement 7, we're talking about flood prevention work, services, essential infrastructure, and then making sure that there can be the physical link between one hospital, which is revenue funded with a particular special purpose vehicle, linking into another hospital that's going to have a separate special purpose vehicle.
Correct. Yeah.
Now, in terms of Settlement Agreement 6, which is securing the land, and Settlement Agreement 7, which is the enabling works, you've talked about the additional complexities because of the revenue funded project within the revenue funded project. But if we stand back from that, regardless of whether the project is capital funded or revenue funded, would you still have had to have gone through an equivalent of Settlement Agreement 6 and Settlement Agreement 7?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Because again, in basic terms, you need the land to build the hospital and you need the services and infrastructure before you can do so. Thank you. If I could ask you to have in front of you, please, the outline business case for the project from 2008. So that's in Bundle 3, Volume 1, at page 272.
Thank you. I wonder if we could just keep the level of questioning and answering just a little further up, Mr. Currie, so that everyone can hear. And I'm particularly sensitive on that, but I don't think that I'm the only one. And we've got to bear in mind the YouTube feed. So question and answers, maybe just a little louder.
Certainly, my lord. So, Mr. Currie, I was asking to look to the outline business case from 2008, which begins at Bundle 3, Volume 1, at page 272. You see that?
Yes.
Now, whenever you came into the project in 2009, this document would already have been created and approved. Did you review the document?
I don't think I would have reviewed it in its entirety. I certainly used it as a reference document, I'm sure, to bring me up to speed with the project. Yeah.
Because if we look, for example, to page 376, you see that within that document there's a procurement strategy that's set out.
Yes.
So would that have informed you, for example, of how NHS Lothian intended to go about the procurement exercise when it's a capital project?
It would, yep.
And if we look, for example, on to page 380, paragraph 16.2.14, do you see that?
I do.
Which states, it is proposed that the re-provision of the new CNYP's hospital adopts the Framework Scotland agreements that should be in place by the fourth quarter of 2008, enabling NHSL to minimise the public procurement period and bring design and contractors on board earlier to achieve cost and certainty. Do you see that?
I do.
So is that your understanding of what NHS Lothian wanted to achieve?
Yeah, that's the essence of the framework, in that boards can call down from a framework through a mini competition, though, contractors with not just a building contractor, but a building contractor with a supply chain, and utilise them quicker than going to the open market through competitive tendering.
And again, as is stated there, if you do that for all the reasons that you've given, you can minimise the amount of time that you need to spend on the procurement exercise.
Yes.
And it continues, just returning, NHSL will maximise the pre-design preparation period to progress master planning to secure outline planning consent in relation to the Little France site, thereby mitigating any initial period slippage through a focused use of current internal and external resources and available client input. Do you see that?
I do.
What was your understanding of that terminology?
This is the capital funded days, and it looks like that's suggesting that there may be the need, although I don't think it's, from memory, it didn't happen, where, contrary to what happened in the MPD side, where we did go for an outline planning consent, or planning application principle, as it's now called, which would pave the way for a detailed application by the framework contractor in this case. I can't from memory, I don't think we did get a planning in principle. I may be wrong, for the capital funding scheme.
Thank you. If I can ask you to look on, please, to page 382 and to paragraph 16.4.1.
Yes.
Page 382, paragraph 16.4.1. You see a paragraph beginning, the new build hospital.
I do.
So it states, the new build hospital will follow the design aspirations and guidance laid out in the Policy on Design Quality for NHS Scotland 2006, to which NHSL subscribes and implements through its design champions. The design brief will address these requirements and also the specification and site constraints outlined in section 16.8. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, obviously, as I understand it, you hadn't previously worked within the NHS. You'd worked in the construction industry, but you've just come in to work within the NHS environment. Is that correct?
Yeah, I spent 2 years with a major architectural healthcare practice in the UK, so I wasn't unfamiliar with healthcare.
And what did you understand the Policy and Design Quality for NHS Scotland 2006? What was that?
I think it was an ambition initiative to bring the quality of healthcare buildings up in standard in terms of architectural quality. And I was aware that there was subsequent amendments to that as well. I think it was Vision for Health, I think it was called, or something at the time. So it was an impetus to try and bring healthcare buildings up to a much better quality environment.
So in terms of when you come into the project, you've seen that this has been approved by the board, approved by Scottish Government, that the build has to be in compliance with the Policy and Design Quality for NHS Scotland 2006 at this point.
Yes.
So would you, in your role as project director, have had to consider that policy?
I'm sure I did at the time, or I certainly was aware of it. I can't remember the detail, I'm sorry.
It's just, I think all I really want to ascertain is within NHS Lothian, whose responsibility would it be to make sure that any design for the hospital complied with that policy?
Well, from memory, I think the design champions had been appointed long before I joined. There was a design champion at board executive level and then one at technical level. Obviously, in my role as project director, I would be heavily involved in design. Yeah.
So again, just so I understand this, your understanding would be that the policy would be understood at someone at a board level. And I think you mentioned someone at a technical level.
Yeah.
Again, thinking back to that organogram, we know where the board level individual would sit. Where would the technical person sit?
I think the technical level would be the Director of Capital Planning and his role sitting on the project board and overseeing that as an assurance type role.
And at that time, would that have been Ian Graham?
That would be in, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If I can ask you to look to the 2006 design policy, so if we could look to bundle 3, please, volume 1 at page 113. So that's bundle 3, volume 1 at page 113. The first page should simply say a policy on design quality for Scotland. If we look onto the next page, you'll see in the top right-hand corner there's a date of the 23rd of October 2006. Do you see that?
I do.
And it's a document headed up, a policy on design quality for NHS Scotland. Does this ring any bells? Have you seen this document before?
Not recently. It's vague bells, I think, would be ringing.
No, that's fine. In fairness, we'll look at the document, and again, if you simply can't remember the detail or you haven't seen the document, please do let me know. So it begins in the summary stating, this letter provides colleagues with a statement of the department's policy on design quality for NHS Scotland Annex A. So effectively, this is being provided to chief executives of NHS boards, as you see in the 4-action sign on the right-hand side. But really, the policy that it's providing begins from page 117 onwards. So on page 117, you'll see a document called A Policy on Design Quality for NHS Scotland from 2006. Do you see that?
I do.
And again, does this ring any bells whatsoever with you?
It does in the sense of, I seem to recall an initiative called Vision for Health, but I may have got the wrong label. And it was something that the Scottish Health Directorate were starting to push, yeah, through the use of ANDS, Architectural and Design Scotland. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. If we could look on within this policy to page 125, please.
I have it here. Yeah.
And you see that in the top it's called Mandatory Requirements. And if I can ask you to look to paragraph 5, so mandatory requirement 5, beginning all NHS Scotland bodies. That's page 125, paragraph 5. Do you see that?
I do.
So it states, all NHS Scotland bodies engaged in the procurement of both new build and refurbishment of healthcare buildings must use and properly utilise the English Department of Health's activity database as an appropriate tool for briefing, design and commissioning. If deemed inappropriate for a particular project and an alternative tool or approach is used, the responsibility is placed upon the NHS Scotland body to demonstrate that the alternative is of equal quality and value in its application. You see that?
I do.
So when you come into the project, was it your understanding that the activity database was going to be used as the tool for design?
Absolutely. It's an industry standard. That is one proprietary software package of 2, I think, mainly in the UK. Every architectural practice in healthcare in the land uses that, or Codebook, I think is the other one. Whether it's mandatory or not, it is the basic building block of developing the very detailed specifications needed for rooms within a healthcare establishment. So It is, yeah, absolutely essential, an integral part of the design process.
Thank you. And if we could look on to page 133, please. So the full paragraph just above the client designer advisor, so it's a paragraph beginning, spaces designed using ADB. So page 133, do you see that paragraph?
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
And it states, spaces designed using ADB data automatically comply with English planning guidance, such as health building notes, HBNs, and health technical memoranda, HTMs, as ADB forms an integral part of the English guidance publication process. While Scottish users can create their own project-specific briefs and designs using ADB's extensive library of integrated graphics and text, which includes room data sheets, room layouts, and departmental room schedules, extreme care should be taken to ensure that such data generated by the package are consistent and compliant with Scottish specific guidance, such as Scottish Health Planning Notes, Scottish Hospital Planning Notes, and Scottish Health Technical Memoranda as published by Health Facilities Scotland. Do you see that?
I do.
And again, was that your understanding of what NHS Lothian should be doing in terms of the design for the hospital?
Yeah, and I would add to that as well, the ADB sheets are, or the ADB library, the database, can at times be a bit cumbersome and does not on all occasions deal with specific clinical fine-tuning of the use of spaces and rooms. So one board or one set of clinicians might have a slightly different way of operating in an area. That would mean that the ADB, the equipment scheduling and the provisions in it have to be modified in a bespoke way for rooms.
So you used the term ADB sheets. Other witnesses have used the term room data sheets.
Yeah.
Are you really saying that your understanding was that room data sheets were going to be created from the activity database?
Yeah, I like to use the phrase room data sheets because that is the output from the process, given that the ADB is one building block. It's a very central building block for it, but it's then modified by the users, by the board, and by whatever their specific circumstances to that room, if it's a space that we're talking about. So the ADB is part of the process to arrive at a room data sheet.
So ADB is effectively the computer package that allows you to create a physical room data sheet.
Yes, it's a proprietary software package that you subscribe to. Yeah.
Okay. And again, your understanding as set out in the policy here is if you use the ADB package, it's going to comply with English guidance such as health technical memoranda. But you've said in your experience, both in the private sector and when you come into the NHS, is that you would still have to specifically check that it complies with any specific guidance such as Scottish Health Technical Memoranda.
Yes, and the unique arrangements of the rooms and the client's desires and requirements.
So again, just so I can be clear about the intention, and again, I'm talking at this stage about the intention of NHS Lothian. When you come into the project, is it the intention of NHS Lothian that the design for the hospital will fully comply with the guidance set out here, including Scottish Health Technical Memorandum?
Yes.
And again, just so I'm absolutely clear, what would your position be in terms of within the project, that organogram we looked at, whose responsibility is it ultimately to ensure that there is compliance with Scottish Health Technical Memoranda?
In which part of the project, capital funded or MPD?
If at this stage we're talking about capital funding.
Well, it's the NEC3 contract, which is the one that was used, it'd be 3 anyway at that stage. That is a process of collaboration, certainly between the client and the builder. So the client, in our case, the health board, prepares what's called employer's requirements. They set out the clinical requirements, particularly for each room. So we would prepare clinical output specifications, they would refer to SHTMs, et cetera, relevant at the time. The builder then takes that and he plays back to us what's called contractors' proposals. We then work collaboratively with the builder to get to a package of information called works information in the contract. That works information then is delivered by the builder, and unless there are caveats or derogations in it to the contrary, the responsibility is for the builder to provide a facility in compliance with the works information. The works information would refer to any health technical memoranda.
So again, just to be clear, your understanding would be in a design and build contract that risk of non-compliance would sit with the contractor?
Unless it's derogated from in the works information package, yeah.
And in terms of internally at NHS Lothian, you used the term we a few times whenever you're saying we. The inquiries heard evidence from both Mrs Sainsbury and Mrs Goldsmith, who sat on the board of NHS Lothian, and both their evidence was to the effect that in terms of technical guidance such as Scottish Health technical memorandums, that's not something that they would be considering at board level. So in terms of ensuring that compliance, where within the organisation does responsibility sit?
It's really the project team and any advisors and consultants that they would use. Where we would have a specific query on an issue, we would always refer to HFS as the national body of expertise.
Okay. So am I right in thinking when you're talking about levels, are we talking about the project board, or are we talking specifically about you and your role as project director?
I would say it lay with the project team and myself as project director, yeah.
Now, you mentioned HFS, Health Facilities Scotland. 2006, we're looking at the 2006 policy. What role, if any, the Health Facilities Scotland have in ensuring compliance with technical guidance?
I think their role stayed pretty constant all the way through the project, through its different phases, in the sense that where we had a specific query or we wanted advice, be it on infection control, be it on high voltage cables, I seem to remember, ventilation, water, we would go to HFS and seek guidance and advice. So it was an advisory role.
Thank you. I still want to stay within the capital funded stage. That's the period up to the 10th of November 2010, as you tell us in your statement. And am I right in thinking it's on that day, on the 10th of November 2010, that NHS Lothian becomes aware that the project's no longer going to have capital funding?
That does ring a bell, yes.
Did NHS Lothian have any advanced warning from Scottish Government that was going to take place?
Not to my knowledge. No, the project team certainly didn't.
So at this point, you'd mentioned that a company called BAM had been appointed as, I think you referred to it as principal supply chain partner. What's happened in the project up to this point? BAM are in place, but what's happened, what's been agreed at this point?
We really took the project to a stage where it was ready for a planning application, a detailed planning application to be made. We had worked on the detailed design to get to that stage, sufficient enough that BAM could start to then go and actually get subcontractors' interest, subcontractors' prices. So in other words, working to what's called an NEC, option C, I think it was, a target price. So the design was pretty well developed. We were about to make a planning application. We were in discussions with Consort on the basis of what became SA6 that we spoke about earlier. They were taking a bit more time, I seem to recall, and we were slipping in programme at that stage. I think I did report to the programme board round about that time that we were slipping because of that. So the project was pretty well developed for a children's only hospital.
Now, the inquiries heard evidence that the planned contract was going to be an NEC 3 standard form contract. Could you just explain what's your understanding of an NEC 3 standard form contract?
Yeah, it's new engineering contract. It's one that's used extensively by public sector organisations and private sector. And I described it, I think, a bit earlier in terms of employers' requirements, contractors' proposals, works information. It tries to ensure that both parties are open and transparent in terms of issues, in terms of progress, trying to flag up as early as possible risks or potential difficulties coming. It's very management hungry, certainly on the contracting side. It needs a lot of management input. It is very program driven. Programs are produced by the shed load at every stage in the project. They're used for valuation and payment purposes. So it is quite an intensive process. It can work very successfully though. I've worked on projects where it's been very successful.
And in terms of that contract, the NEC3 contract, where would design risk sit? Does it sit with the client or the contractor?
I think, as I said earlier, it sits, in my estimation, with the contractor in terms of the agreed works information.
Now, you mentioned in your evidence that you considered that the design was at quite an advanced stage. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was. It couldn't have been built at that stage, but it was at a stage where we made a planning application. So it was certainly a detailed design stage and getting into the real nitty-gritty of subcontract packages.
So in terms of engineering specifications such as technical specifications for a ventilation system, have they been created at this stage, or does that come later?
They would be starting to be looked at in detail by BAM and their engineers, yeah.
Do you know if BAM had produced room data sheets at this stage?
I would suspect they would be working on them. I can't recall the detail.
But again, I appreciate it's a long time ago, and it might be more about what your understanding was. We're not talking about necessarily specific designs, but what was your understanding in terms of whether BAM would be preparing room data sheets for the project?
Oh, they would absolutely be, yes.
Now, in terms of the NEC3 contract, that's whenever it's the capital project. There's then the change to the revenue funded model. Could the standard form NEC3 contract simply have been used for the revenue funded model?
No, I seem to recall many conversations with colleagues and SFT and others that the senior debt providers, the funders, the financiers would want to ensure that all the risk sits squarely with the contractor, with the builder, and a lump sum price with the contractor taking the risk would be where they would want to go. NEC3 is a bit more open-ended in terms of the final price. So that wouldn't have held muster with the finance side.
So in terms of the contract structures, whenever the funding model changes, the contractual structures have to change as well. Is that your
Fundamentally, yes.
Now, I'd like to ask you some questions about the period now when there's the switch to the revenue funded project. Can you just explain what impact that had on the project? You've told the inquiry about the stage that NHS Lothian had got to with BAM, but what impact does that then have on the project when the funding model changes?
It was taking stock, I think, as I mentioned earlier, about where we were and where we needed to go and how we got there. And as I said, I think I said earlier, forgotten now, that one of the fundamental bases of MPD is risk transfer to the private sector to achieve certain accounting rule targets or requirements. And as part of that risk transfer, design risk needs to transfer in its entirety, with the exception of something that we called operational functionality, which was a development of clinical functionality. It was operational functionality because it included some of our facilities management requirements. So they are essential and mandatory requirements. So it was how did we communicate all this to the bidders was the first task, and what resources did we need to do that, given that we had to basically totally stop what we were doing. BAM didn't continue. We had to then see it over a technical angle, how we could secure advisory services, and also bringing in, as I said earlier, I think financial and legal. And also to be clear on the scope, which I mentioned earlier, and just check that it was the same location, etc., etc.
So if I can ask you just to have your statement in front of you, and if we could look together at paragraph 19, please. Paragraph 19, the second full sentence beginning, we had to prepare a revised business case.
Top of page 208, is it?
It's the bottom of page 207 on my copy,
All right,
beginning,
19,
we had
yeah.
to prepare a revised business case. See that?
Yep, got that.
So it says we had to prepare a revised business case, prepare for a new procurement model, and consider how best to utilise the design work already done. This involved liaising with internal and external stakeholders and independent advisors. So in terms of, you talk about the internal and external stakeholders, what do you mean by that?
I think it was principally the clinical teams who had been through, you know, certainly in my longer, a year and a half for me, but longer in terms of the project before I arrived, getting to a stage where they articulated and documented their clinical requirements. So it was how we kept them on side, if you like, taking the project forward, given they're all very, very busy people and time is short. So we had to do a lot of internal discussion with the clinical stakeholders principally, I seem to recall.
And in terms of the independent advisors, who was it you were engaging with at this point?
Well, we eventually, I can't remember when they came on board. As soon as possible, I think was the need. But so we had EY as our financial advisors, and McRoberts as our legal advisors, and Mott MacDonald were our technical advisors. So we'd been talking to them as soon as we could get access to them.
Okay. So you say Mott MacDonald are the technical advisors. What role do they have at this point in the project?
Well, they were brought in because we needed to get somebody who could demonstrate experience and as recent experience as possible of major acute healthcare PFI experience, and we had to do that as quickly as possible whilst complying with procurement rules. And we set upon OGC buying solutions, I think, as a framework, a national framework. Mott MacDonald were on that framework, so we could call off, and they were at pre-agreed rates, etc., and commercial detail. So they had also demonstrated that, and particularly one individual who I think you're seeing on Friday, Mr. Cantley, had direct experience of Forth Valley PFI, and they demonstrated that they could bring that very recent knowledge to PFI, MPD as it was now. So we selected Mott MacDonald on that basis.
So you describe bringing Mott MacDonald in because of their acute healthcare PFI experience, but just at a slightly more granular level of detail, what were they going to be doing? What were they going to be giving you advice on?
Basically, three arms to it, I suppose. Technical advisors in the sense of bringing their technical expertise and how to shape and produce the documentation needed for us to communicate our requirements. So the BCRs, as they were called, board's construction requirements, the process of engaging with the bidders we hope to have, which was very elaborate and detailed. They also brought facilities management experience in terms to that, and how to run a hospital of that size. And they also brought project management support as well, which was very welcome in terms of bolstering the internal team.
And in terms of the skill set that you've talked about Mott MacDonald bringing to the project, did those types of skills exist internally within NHS Lothian for this type of revenue-funded project?
Not in that level of detail. The one advantage of having an organisation like Mott MacDonald is that they have a huge range of specialisms, from helicopter engineers to acousticians to fire engineers. This project had just about every design discipline that you could imagine at some point in it. So we would not have anywhere near that level of experience. I don't think any health board in the land would have that level of experience.
And again, I think I picked you up as saying that you had obtained Mott MacDonald services through a framework agreement, is that correct?
Yes, a national government framework arrangement, yeah.
In terms of the shift from capital to revenue funding, what role, if any, did Scottish Futures Trust play at that point?
Scottish Futures Trust were there to give advice and guidance. They were principally concerned with affordability and programme and sufficient transfer of risk, as I said earlier. And they, as I said, they many times said, "We're here as your critical friend, Brian." So they were very supportive, a lot of dialogue with them. They had views that we didn't share at times, but we came to a very amicable understanding and direction. I think I mentioned one of them before about the reference design team. I seem to remember quite a bit of dialogue about just what the reference design should show. They were getting slightly anxious that we were starting to define too clearly be too prescriptive for bidders. Curvy walls, I think, came up many times, and we eventually made it, well, hoped, and I'm sure we did, made it quite clear to the bidders that these were indicative requirements only, and that you didn't necessarily need to do curvy walls unless you wanted to do curvy walls. So there was a lot of dialogue with them, a lot of close cooperation with SFT.
And in terms of their role, are they providing that critical friend assistance simply on the financial side of the project, or is it a wider remit?
I think from memory, it was very much about the affordability, as I said, so about the finance side of it. They were heavily involved in financial close. I think SFT were the last person to give the nod to the swap rate, as I seem to, it was called, at 25 minutes past 3 on a Friday afternoon with Brussels on the phone. I think, so it was very much the finance side of it and the general, how it fitted into their programme of NPD.
I want to turn now and ask you some questions about the reference design that you mention in your statement from paragraph 22 onwards. Again, I just want to stress what the inquiry is considering at this day in the May hearings. The inquiry is interested in general issues, in particular the decision to utilise a reference design approach, but the specific development of the design, the granular detail, that's going to come at a later stage of the inquiry. So if we could just begin at a very basic level, what's your understanding of a reference design? What does that term mean?
Well, we arrived at a reference design. It could have been called many things. Diagram probably might have been more useful now in hindsight, but reference design, it essentially built on what was more commonly known as an exemplar design in PFIs, where the client prepares a design that illustrates in conceptual terms a possible solution in architectural engineering at a very high level concept. But because we had the need to communicate to bidders not just a mandatory requirement and operational functionality that I mentioned earlier, but the very clear and distinct obligations that we had from Consort Healthcare in terms of Supplemental Agreement 6, we decided we needed to illustrate that again for the bidders. So we called it reference design rather than exemplar, because it was a bit more prescriptive than an exemplar design would have been. It was a very useful tool in the sense of communicating to the bidders, but also communicating internally. It also, the operational functionality bit is really important, because that's the bit we salvaged, if you like, from the capital funded scheme. All the good work that had been done by the clinical teams with BAM and with ourselves, we didn't use BAM design, but what we did was we stripped back to the clinical pathways and the clinical adjacencies and the concepts of rooms and spaces and adjacencies, and used that to inform what became operational functionality as illustrated in the reference design. It also was very, very useful in terms of developing a cost plan internally. So the quantity surveyors could actually see some drawings, again at high level, but it's easier for them if they see drawings than just narrative. It was also used in the ongoing negotiations and then eventual success of achieving planning in principle from the City of Edinburgh Council. SFT were very keen on it, as we were, because it meant that bidders would have a reduced risk in terms of abortive tendering costs, because the time when we got to competitive dialogue would have been shorter than it would have been if we had given them an exemplar design which was not as prescriptive. So it meant saving in time later.
Just so I'm understanding this, an exemplar design is fairly generalised concept design as opposed to a reference design which is more detailed in terms of the health board's requirements.
Only more detailed in the sense that it conveyed the supplemental agreement consort obligations that we had. Operational functionality, I think an exemplar designs is an exemplar design as well, but it would probably be a clinical functionality only. So we took it, we involved FM in that as well. What it doesn't do, it doesn't go anywhere near the engineering parameters and compliance in that terms. All that is contained within what called the board's construction requirements. So it's a diagram more than anything. I always saw it as a diagram, a schematic of an architectural realisation of operational functionality.
Now, you mentioned that there was a desire to retain design work that had already been done by BAM, and it's a capital funded project. Can you just explain to the inquiry the point in 2010 where it's shifting to the revenue funded model? What discussions are taking place internally in NHS Lothian about trying to retain that design work?
Well, that was one of the first challenges, was how do we keep the clinical teams on board, knowing that we hoped and we did succeed in getting 3 bidders interested in the project. So as it transpired, 3 parallel work streams of competitive dialogue. If we were starting from scratch again, literally from an exemplar design, and going back involving clinicians, they would have had 3 parallel rounds of meetings engaging with each clinical team, which would have been, I think, 9 near impossible. So we thought, how can we use all the good work that we had done with BAM, utilise that and present that to the bidders as a starting point, i.e. the operational functionality side of it. So,
and within NHS Lothian, again, thinking back to the organogram we looked at, who or which body made the decision that it should be a reference design that's utilised for the revenue funded project?
I recall it's very much a collective effort. SFT, for the reasons I said earlier, were keen. We were keen. There were various papers done, I seem to recall, as we developed our ideas with options. It was then approved at project board level. I would imagine it would probably even go higher than that, I can't recall. But it was a joint SFT NHS Lothian consensus view. And Watt MacDonald as well believed it was the right approach.
Okay, so just so I'm understanding it, effectively, I'm correct in saying you sat on the project board, so did the project board thought it was the right thing to do? Presumably you as project director thought it was the right thing to do?
I did, yes.
You mentioned that you were getting advice from Watt MacDonald. Again, not talking about the detail, but generality, what are Watt MacDonald telling you about using a reference design approach?
Well, I think they mapped out for us with SFT the advantages of it, the slight nuances that could be played on how to actually move reference design into the competitive dialogue phase. So it was very much an advisory role.
Yeah. And again, what I'm picking up from your evidence is that there wasn't really an alternative view. It doesn't sound like anyone was suggesting there should be anything other than a reference design.
Yes, that was my understanding. It would have been, we couldn't have contemplated, as I said, bringing the clinical teams through that journey from scratch again 3 times as it transpired over.
If I could ask you to have your statement in front of you again, and please to look to paragraph 23, which on my copy is on page 209, so paragraph 23.
Yes, I have it.
So paragraph 23, you state that following a review meeting, including Scottish Futures Trust, Scottish Government Health Directorate and McRoberts LLP, NHS Lothian's legal advisors on 23rd December 2010, it was concluded that it would be beneficial to take a reference design to market. Just obviously looking there, I appreciate it's a long time ago, but do you have any recollections of that meeting on the 23rd of December 2010 and what was being discussed?
It was one of many meetings, and it was remarkable how quickly after the 10th of November it all happened. No, there was various discussions with those parties, as I just said, around reference design and the advantages in using it.
And again, you state, as you've told us in evidence still at paragraph 23, this was not just a case of taking BAM's design and rebadging it as a
No,
reference design.
No.
So again, just at a high level of generality, how much work was required to take forward the design?
In terms of from this stage onwards?
From the BAM design to the reference design?
It was basically taking the principles behind the design and adhering to that and using that as a basis to develop the reference design and our operational functionality. So how much work it became part of the reference design team's remit to do that.
And if I could ask you to look on to paragraph 26 within your statement, please.
Yeah.
State at paragraph 26 that one of the key driving factors in adopting a reference design, which was set by everyone involved, was to salvage as much of the time, effort and cost that had already been incurred. It was the sensible thing to do. We did not want to throw out what had been hard-won clinical input, for example, discussions around clinical models and pathways. To repeat the process would eat into precious clinical time for the clinicians and medics. And again, that's really consistent with what you've told the inquiry today.
Yes.
And you continue at paragraph 27, setting out the benefits as you saw them of a reference design approach. You say, in summary, the benefits of a reference design were: 1, enhanced cost certainty at the outlined business case. Why would it give enhanced cost certainty?
Because I think, as I mentioned earlier, it would enable a cost plan to be developed, which would be more accurate than it would have been if surveyors were just working off narrative and specifications. When something's drawn in a diagram or a building form, it gives them an idea of all sorts of things to do with envelope, cladding, etc., etc. So,
and then the second benefit, as you see two fundamentals of the clinical design were complete to the extent that there would be very limited future engagement of scarce clinical resource.
yep.
So again, just so I understand that correctly, I think you had mentioned earlier that it wasn't a complete design, but you're saying here that there wouldn't have to be significant further clinical input. So just how developed is the design at this stage?
It would have meant much less clinical input at the competitive dialogue stage. They wouldn't be going back to first principles and looking at, is that room the right adjacency to the other room or department to department. So it was setting that as our operational functionality requirement. So there was a huge amount of work still to do, of course, but it meant the competitive dialogue process did not rewind back to a stage before that.
You say 3, it would shorten the competitive dialogue phase. Why was that important?
It was the need to get on and finish and deliver a children's hospital in Edinburgh. It had been long, protracted experience to date, and everybody was keen to get it finished and get it delivered as soon as possible.
And then you say 4, utilise available programme time, and then 5, it would minimise abortive design cost and tendering risk for unsuccessful bidders, which again you've told us about in your evidence already. If I can ask you to please look at a document in Bundle 3, Volume 2 at page 314. So Bundle 3, Volume 2 at page 314. Which should be headed up in the top left-hand corner, Lothian NHS Board Finance and Performance Review Committee.
I have it here, yes.
Dated the 12th of January 2011. We'll see when we get to the bottom of the document that this was a document prepared by Mrs. Goldsmith and Mrs. Sainsbury. But is this a document you've seen before?
Yes, it does ring a bell, yeah.
So we see at 1.1 it sets out that the purpose of the report, the purpose of this report is to provide the Finance and Performance Review Committee with an overview of the progress made over recent weeks to review the Royal Hospital for Sick Children and Department of Clinical Neurosciences reprovision projects following the Scottish Government announcement on the 17th of November 2010 that these projects would be funded under the non-profit distributing model. Do you see that?
Yes.
It's effectively an update to the Finance Committee. We see the recommendations that the committee is invited to, and then the second bullet point, approve progressing with a detailed reference design for a combined project is a key component of the NPD procurement route, utilising either the current framework contract with BAM or procuring the design team through the Office of Government Commerce. Do you see that?
Yes.
And again, is that what you were talking about whenever you were saying that there was potentially going to be what you referred to as an OGC procurement?
Yes. At that stage, we were examining whether BAM could continue and actually deliver this. Of course, in terms of procurement and contract law, that was not going to be, it was never going to fly. So we quite quickly excluded that option.
And then we see the fourth bullet point, approve the commencement of a tender process to appoint advisors, technical, legal and financial. So is that what became, I think, EY, McRoberts and then Mott MacDonald?
Yes, yes.
On to page 315 at paragraph 4, we see that the background to the MPD, which I won't read out. We could look on to page 318, please, into section 6, procurement options. See at 6.1 it states we have an objective to minimise both the delay to the programme, also the Cabinet Secretary's aspiration, and the abortive and ongoing costs to ensure operational effectiveness going forward and also to manage the overall site consistent with the aims of the bi-quarter development. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, there's reference to there being a desire to minimise delay to the programme and that also being the Cabinet Secretary or the Scottish Government's aspiration. Was that your understanding at this point in the project?
Yes. Yes.
And then at paragraph 6.2, that the various procurement options are set out. And then on page 319, we see various procurement options being set out. And then at page 320, in paragraph 6.4, approximately 4 lines up from the bottom of that paragraph, you see the wording beginning, although this decision.
Yes.
6.4, 4 lines up from the bottom. Although this decision requires to be made by NHS Lothian as the statutory authority, it will be important that this is endorsed by SFT and SGHD. Do you see that?
I do.
So again, was that your understanding as project director that ultimately this is a decision to be taken by NHS Lothian, but that it would be hopefully endorsed by Scottish Futures Trust and Scottish Government?
Yes, it was, yeah.
And just for completeness, on page 322, see it's section 10, Mrs Goldsmith and Mrs Sainsbury say 10.1, SGHD and SFT have confirmed their willingness to work with the board's team on developing the business case requirements, minimise the programme, but retain the appropriate governance. Do you see that?
I do.
And in terms of your role as project director, do you recognise that statement? Did the Scottish Government and Scottish Futures Trust work with the board as the project moved forward?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
If I could ask you, please, to look within Bundle 3, Volume 2 to page 898. So Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 898. You see a document called RHSC plus DCN Approach to Reference Design, May 2012.
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
And we see that at the bottom that there's the Mott MacDonald name.
Yep.
Can you just explain, what was your understanding of this paper, the approach to reference design?
I think that must be getting to the stage where we were concluding just as it says, the approach to reference design. So this would be getting into the actual mechanics of it, I think, at that stage, May 2012, I would have thought so. It basically sets out in detail the methodology of producing the reference design, the purpose of it, and how it would be used with the bid process to follow.
No, again, as I've said, probably repeated, I don't want to get into the detail of the actual design at the minute, but is it fair to say that the board is having this paper prepared by Mott MacDonald as external advisors addressing the reference design as at May 2012?
Yes.
And if we could look on within the executive summary to page 905, please. Do you see a section just above the bullet points beginning, the key benefits are seen as being?
Yes, I have it, yep.
So the paper by Mott MacDonald states on page 905, the key benefits are seen as being enhanced cost certainty at OBC, clinical design largely complete, very limited future engagement, scarce clinical resource, it shortens competitive dialogue phase, utilises available programme time, parallel with consort negotiations, i.e. no overall delay to strategic programme, and minimises abortive design cost for unsuccessful bidders. Do you see that?
I do.
And again, is that consistent with your understanding of the benefits as set out in your statement?
Yes, it is.
And then if we look on to page 907, paragraph 1.1, page 907, paragraph 1.1, we see the purpose of the report being set out.
I do.
So the purpose of this report is to outline the reasons for preparing and the purpose of a reference design, outline the level of detail required in a reference design, outline the distinctions between mandatory and non-mandatory elements of a reference design, application of reference design during competitive dialogue, and outline the development of the reference design. So In terms of that detail, that's what we would see if we read on within this paper.
Yes.
If I can ask you to look on, please, to still within bundle 3, this time to volume 2 and to page 892. So bundle 3, volume 2, at page 892. Now, we'll see as we work through the document, but this was a paper prepared by you on the 8th of May 2012. Could you just explain what the purpose of this paper was?
It looks like it's a paper supporting and tabling basically the Mott MacDonald document that we've just discussed. I would imagine. Scroll down.
If we see in the top left-hand corner, it's headed up Project Steering Board Meeting, 11th May 2012. So again, is this a paper that you're preparing to provide to that board? Or that,
yes,
that
the Project Steering Board was the title of what became the Project Board. It was even called Programme Board at one time. So that's the Project Board that we've referred to earlier.
And we see that the purpose of the report, paragraph 1.1, the purpose of this report is to recommend that the Project Steering Board confirms the report RHSC plus DCN approach to reference design dated March 2012 is used as a basis for accurately conveying NHSL's intentions to bidders. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we look on to page 893 to paragraph 3. We see at paragraph 3.1, the reference design has been concluded following the Project Steering Board's approval in July 2011 of the strategy for its development, given the benefits arising. Do you see that?
Yes.
So it seems that at this point in time that the decision has been made by what's called the Project Steering Board, but you said that then becomes the Project Board, that there's to be a reference design approach adopted for the revenue-based procurement.
Yes, I think this report is really just crossing the T's and dotting the I's in terms of how the reference design would be actually implemented. Because we had been working on it for, well, a while before that.
Key. And if we look on to page 895, just for completeness, we'll see that it's completed by Brian Currie, Project Director, on the 8th of May 2012. Do you see that?
I do.
The next document I'd like to have in front of you, please, is in Bundle 3, Volume 2, at page 409. So Bundle 3, Volume 2, at page 409. So is this a document called NHS Lothian RHCYP plus DCN Little France Procurement Options, June 2011, and we see that this is in the bottom left-hand corner, got Davis Langdon, and in the bottom right-hand corner, Mott MacDonald.
I do, yeah.
Can you just explain what your understanding of this paper was?
I think that without scrolling down, just reminding myself, I think this just sets out, again, some of the detailed arrangements for competitive dialogue and the whether we should be moving with a number of bidders, assuming they were enticed to participate, and when we would go to maybe 2 bidders and rather than go with 3 or 4 right to the end. It'd be that sort of thing. I think I would need to just look down to remind myself.
No, certainly. So if we look to the contents page on page 414, you see it says Introduction, Exemplar Reference Design Approach. identified options, estimated costs for each option, soft market testing, and then agreed way forward.
Okay, yep.
Is this input that's being provided by Mott MacDonald in relation to procurement options?
Yes.
So if we look on to page 415 in the introduction section.
I do see it, yeah.
Since the combined RHCYP and DCN project will now be procured under NPD, NHSL has been in discussions with the Scottish Futures Trust to determine the shortest possible procurement route. The procurement process options and their associated timescales are directly linked to the approach adopted on the reference design, and this paper considers 3 options around this, along with their benefits and drawbacks. Do you see that?
I do.
And then if we look to the section headed up exemplar/reference design approach, second full paragraph just above the bullet points, it states, however, the intention here, based on discussions with SFT to date, is to go a step further and develop a reference design and mandate certain elements as part of the ITPD. The purpose of doing so is to, 1, reduce the overall NPD procurement timescales and associated bidding costs. Secondly, reduce the amount of clinical user consultation through the dialogue period. Provide greater cost certainty at outlined business case stage, and provide greater certainty over the eventual design solution under NPD. See that?
I do.
If I could ask you to look on to page 419 and to the penultimate paragraph beginning each respondent. So this is in the section 5, soft market testing.
Yes.
So it's a section of the report that outlines some soft market testing that had been conducted. And in the penultimate paragraph on page 419, it states, each respondent was advised of the option A, B and C approach. The consensus was that bidders would prefer the design to be treated as an exemplar to enable them to have the freedom to truly innovate on the project. Whilst option A gives some degree of flexibility, this was considered to be fairly limited. So in terms of the soft market testing, those in the market came back and said we'd prefer an exemplar design.
Yeah.
Why did NHS Lothian then go with a reference design?
Because that's not a surprise. I think on the contracting side, they would like more latitude. We were unable to give them that for the reasons I gave earlier, that we had very set obligations to consort through Supplemental Agreement 6 that we could not move from. So they were anchors, if you like, in design terms. So we were unable, essentially, to give the construction industry the degree of latitude that those 4 companies expressed a desire for.
If I could ask you to have in front of you, please, in bundle 7, page 687. And in fairness to you, Mr. Currie, it might be helpful if we looked at paragraph 28 of your statement before looking at this document.
Okay, I have it. Thanks.
So we see at paragraph 28 of your statement, you state, the project team initially intended to complete the reference design within 12 months based on 3 rounds of consultation with clinical staff.
Yeah.
The project board immediately sought to reduce this period to 8 months with 2 rounds of clinical engagement. My recollection is that it was SFT who sat on the project board who were keen to shorten the programme of activities in relation to the reference design production, competitive dialogue, and between preferred bidder and financial close, rather than NHS Lothian. So again, just so the inquiry can understand it, it seems like there was a desire to really compress the period of the procurement exercise. Now, if competitive tendering is aimed at getting best value for the public sector, can you just explain why was it that the procurement exercise was to be constrained?
I think it was I mentioned earlier that the desire to bring the delivery of this project ahead and as quickly as possible. So SFT were looking at every opportunity to speed things up, essentially. We were having to balance that with our views on doing it in a way that would be adequate to provide the information that we needed. And I certainly recall competitive dialogue programme meetings where SFT shaved quite a bit of months off the programme, and as it transpired, we had to extend dialogue by about the same period again. We introduced supplemental dialogue meetings at the time. So it was just that overall and quite understandable desire to bring the project on stream and deliver it as quickly as possible.
And if we could then look to the document in Bundle 7 at page 687, this is a minute of the project board from the 13th of May 2011. And then if we could look within box 2 to the third last entry, do you see a paragraph beginning SFT and SGHD expressed?
Yes.
So it says SFT and SGHD expressed a strong view that the period indicated for competitive dialogue did not reflect the production of a reference design and was based on an exemplar design. Yep. This period, in their view, needs review with a considerable reduction in duration likely at Action BC.
That's exactly the point I just made, and I do recall that, yes.
Okay. And it said Action BC is BC.
That's me, yes.
Is you, and what action, if any, did you then take?
We shortened the programme from memory.
So what was going to be omitted? What was originally going to take place that was then omitted in terms of the competitive dialogue stage?
I think it's the amount of dialogue. So it was just to speed things up and not have the same amount of dialogue, essentially. We felt that brought risks to the project, and brought risks to the quality of the final product. We argued, I remember at the time, very strongly in favour of maintaining the programme that we advocated.
If I could ask you within your statement to look at paragraph 47, please. So paragraph 47,
yes.
Page 216, you state, I have been asked whether the adoption of the reference design approach was unusual given the number of mandatory elements. I would say that it probably was. We were working with an unusual set of circumstances. So again, without getting into the real detail, can you just explain why the reference design was unusual, but why NHS Lothian considered it was appropriate for this particular project?
Yeah, I think, again, at the risk of repeating myself, it was the very set requirements that we had to adhere to enshrined in Supplemental Agreement 6 with Consort that we were unable to pass that on. We were unable to give bidders the latitude of deciding for themselves where they would bring gas, electricity and water into the building or into the site, for example. So we had to be prescriptive, and we took the view that that was communicated to this thing called reference design.
And were the Scottish Futures Trust supportive of the decision taken by NHS Lothian?
I believe so, yes, yes.
I'd like to ask you some questions, Mr. Currie, about design assurance, which you mentioned within your statement. So if we could look on perhaps to paragraph 56 of your statement. Please.
Yes.
So you state there that there's a programme of briefing activities in 2010 that sets out the extent of engagement and range of topics discussed in conjunction with a note of the clinical representation in these activities and meetings. And then you go on to say specifically in the final sentence in paragraph 56, clinical input would not have referred to SHTM 0301 and other parameters such as air changes per hour. So if the clinicians aren't providing that assurance, who is in terms of the project?
What that's referring to is clinicians themselves are probably not that conversant generally with very specific engineering requirements. But the clinical output specifications, which are in the billboard's constructions requirements, do refer to things like SHTMs. The current at the time, it would be probably 2025 rather than 0301, the ventilation particular memoranda.
And one particular design assurance procedure that you mentioned within your statement is called the NHS design assessment process. I think it's sometimes called an NDAP. Are you familiar with that term?
I am, yes.
Could you explain to the inquiry what is an NHS design assessment process?
It's used throughout projects in NHS to assess the suitability of the developing design in terms of architectural quality, things like, is the entrance in the right place? Can you find your way to the stairs? What is the overall quality of the environment in terms of contact with the externals, daylight provision, all these fundamental architectural requirements. It may also look at whether the building services strategy is correct in terms of sustainability, particularly nowadays. So it's quite broad ranging in its review.
And was that review carried out in relation to the project we've been discussing this morning?
No, neither at the capital funded stage or the MPD stage.
And again, you say that at paragraph 66 of your statement. In terms, just to be fair to you, you say that it wasn't done because we had already secured business case approval.
Yes, I think the Chief Executive's letter was July 10, followed by the SCIM update guidance in 2011. The OBC for this project was approved in 2008, so we were, if you like, off and running before the need or the requirement for an NDAP was necessary. We just took the same direction of travel when we moved into the MPD stage as well.
Okay, so we'll come on and look at all of that guidance talked about, but again, am I correct in understanding that your understanding as project director is that there didn't have to be an NDAP for the project?
Correct.
Okay. And again, could you just explain again why did you consider there didn't have to be an NDAP?
Because the arrangements, or I think it's described in the letter, I need to look at the exact letter, was that projects that were already in train, if you like, or moving forward would not be subject to an NDAP review, something like that. I can't remember the actual word.
We'll come on and look at it. As I said at the very start, it's not a memory test, Mr. Currie, but what I'm interested to know is whose decision was that to make? Was it your decision as project director? Was it the board of NHS Lothian? Was it Scottish Government? Whose decision was it to take it at that point?
I would assume it was the interpretation of the CEL.
And when you say the interpretation by
NHS Lothian, I can't remember who would be involved with it at the time. It was certainly, well, when was it? July 10, so we've been moving towards the abrupt halt, if you like, wasn't it, in November 10, yeah.
Sorry, I just missed that. Moving towards?
Sorry, the change in procurement from capital to NPD. I'm just trying to place it in my timeline.
And again, I appreciate this is a long time ago, and you're very fairly saying your understanding is that it didn't take place. But can you recall if that was your decision, project boards, or the board of NHS Lothian?
It wasn't my decision that I remember consciously making it. It was something that we were doing. I can't remember even when it was discussed, to be honest.
So was there a discussion around about whether an NDAP should take place?
There certainly was. When we moved into the NPD stage, I remember having those discussions with SFT, and I believe there were discussions between SFT and HFS, which we were not party to, but there was never any clear, right, you're changing track now. You weren't doing it before, you're going to do NPD now. It would have been slightly odd in terms of timing as well at that stage, because of the NPD process, we were generating the reference design, and there was a design review done, I think as you're aware, by SFT and Atkins, which HFS and ANDS also reviewed. But we wouldn't have, I'm struggling to say what the NDAP would have been reviewing other than the reference design. The board's construction requirements held a lot of other information that an NDAP would probably have looked at in a capital funded scheme. And they were in development, early development, when the Atkins review was done from memory. Thank you.
Lord Bray, that's 1 o'clock. I'm just about to turn to look at the detail of the document, so I think that may be a convenient point to break for lunch.
Well, we'll take our lunch break now, Mr. Currie, and if you could be back for 2 o'clock, that would be very good.
Of course.
Thank you.